Imagine a war that exists only in the airwaves. No massive armies marching across borders. No great tank divisions rolling through jungles. Just voices crackling through static, whispering lies so convincing that an entire government collapses without a single decisive battle. This is the story of how the Central Intelligence Agency weaponized fear itself, built phantom rebel armies out of sound and shadow, and used propaganda so sophisticated that even the world's press believed it. This is the story of Operation PBSUCCESS, the 1954 coup that toppled a democratically elected president in Guatemala, not with overwhelming force, but with the terrifying power of illusion. And what makes this operation so disturbing is not just what the CIA did, but how easily it worked. Because when reality itself becomes negotiable, when truth can be manufactured and broadcast into every home, the question is no longer who has the biggest army. The question is who controls what people believe. And in June of 1954, deep in the mountains and cities of Central America, the CIA discovered they could control everything. Guatemala in the early 1950s was a nation caught between centuries. On one side stood the future, fragile and uncertain, represented by a young democracy trying to pull itself free from generations of poverty and exploitation. On the other side stood the past, heavy and entrenched, defended by vast landholdings, foreign corporations, and the legacy of colonial rule that had never truly ended. The country was beautiful and wounded, a place where ancient Mayan communities farmed tiny plots of exhausted soil while massive estates stretched untouched for miles, their fertility wasted, their potential locked away by absentee owners. More than half of Guatemala's private land belonged to fewer than 2% of the population, and most of that land sat idle while families starved. Into this inequity stepped Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, a soldier-turned-reformer who won the presidency in 1951 on a promise to modernize his country and give dignity to its people. Arbenz was not a radical by temperament. He was a pragmatist who believed that land reform, infrastructure development, and economic sovereignty were not revolutionary ideas but necessary steps toward progress. His vision was simple and it was dangerous. Take the uncultivated land from those who hoarded it, compensate them fairly, and redistribute it to landless peasants who would actually farm it. In June of 1952, Arbenz signed Decree 900, the Agrarian Reform Law, which allowed the government to expropriate estates larger than 223 acres that were not being cultivated. It affected only a fraction of landowners, but it touched the untouchable. And one entity in particular found itself in the crosshairs. The United Fruit Company was not just a business. It was an empire. Based in the United States, it owned over 550,000 acres of Guatemalan land, controlled the nation's railroads, operated its main port, and employed thousands of workers under conditions that were barely one step removed from servitude. Of all that land, only a fraction was under cultivation. The rest sat fallow, held in reserve, a strategic buffer to ensure the company could control supply, manipulate prices, and crush any competitor who dared to challenge its dominance. When Arbenz announced that Guatemala would expropriate approximately 234,000 acres of United Fruit's unused land, offering compensation based on the value the company itself had declared for tax purposes, the corporation reacted with fury. It was not just the land, it was the precedent. If Guatemala succeeded, other nations might follow. And so United Fruit began a campaign to paint Arbenz not as a reformer, but as a communist, a Soviet puppet intent on destroying American interests and spreading Marxism through the Western Hemisphere. The company had powerful friends. John Foster Dulles, the United States Secretary of State, had worked as a lawyer for United Fruit. His brother, Allen Dulles, was the Director of Central Intelligence. The connections ran deep, and the narrative they built was simple, compelling, and largely false. But in the paranoid atmosphere of the early Cold War, it was enough. By 1953, the Eisenhower administration had decided that Arbenz had to go. In August of 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower authorized the CIA to undertake a covert operation to remove Jacobo Arbenz from power. The project was codenamed PBSUCCESS, and it came with a budget of $2.7 million earmarked for psychological warfare, political action, subversion, and paramilitary operations. It was not the CIA's first attempt. A year earlier, under President Truman, the agency had planned Operation PB Fortune, a collaboration with Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza to back a disgruntled Guatemalan general named Carlos Castillo Armas. That operation had been shelved, but now it was dusted off, refined, and given the full weight of presidential approval. The CIA's strategy was brutally pragmatic. A direct military invasion would be costly, risky, and politically disastrous if American involvement became public. But a coup disguised as an internal rebellion, orchestrated by exiles and presented as a popular uprising against communist tyranny, could achieve the same result with plausible deniability. The challenge was that Castillo Armas had no real army. His forces numbered fewer than 500 men, poorly trained and equipped, scattered across camps in Honduras and Nicaragua. Against Guatemala's military of several thousand soldiers, they had no chance in a conventional fight. So the CIA decided not to fight a conventional fight. They would fight a psychological one. The operation was meticulously planned across multiple fronts. The CIA recruited and trained approximately 1,625 foreign guerrillas, with thousands more held in reserve, not because the agency expected them to win battles, but because their existence needed to be known. The preparations were only superficially covert. The CIA intended for Arbenz to discover them, to see the camps, to hear the rumors, to feel the noose tightening. Fear was the weapon, and intelligence leaks were the delivery system. At the same time, CIA operatives made covert contact with church leaders throughout Guatemala, persuading them to weave anti-government messages into their sermons, turning pulpits into propaganda platforms. The agency also cultivated relationships within the Guatemalan military, sowing doubt, spreading disinformation, and quietly suggesting that resistance was futile and loyalty to Arbenz was a death sentence. But the centerpiece of the operation, the innovation that would define PBSUCCESS and serve as a model for future covert actions, was something that had never been done at this scale before. The CIA was going to create a radio station that did not exist, broadcasting from a rebel army that was barely real, to convince an entire nation that a massive liberation force was sweeping unstoppably toward the capital. They called it the Voice of Liberation, and it became the most powerful weapon in the entire operation. Radio Liberación, as it was known in Spanish, first came on the air on May 1, 1954. Its broadcasters introduced themselves as freedom fighters transmitting from deep within the Guatemalan jungle, surrounded by thousands of armed patriots who were rising up against the communist dictatorship of Jacobo Arbenz. They spoke with urgency and conviction, their voices crackling through static, describing military victories, government defections, and an unstoppable tide of liberation. The broadcasts were vivid, detailed, and completely fabricated. In reality, the station was not in Guatemala at all. The content was written and produced in Miami by Guatemalan exiles working for the CIA, then flown to Central America and transmitted via a mobile transmitter positioned just outside Guatemalan borders to create the illusion of an internal broadcast. The announcers were skilled, the production values sophisticated, and the psychological impact devastating. Many listeners believed they were hearing authentic reports from the front lines of a civil war. This belief extended far beyond Guatemala itself. Foreign correspondents from publications like the New York Times treated the Voice of Liberation as the most credible source of information about the unfolding crisis, never suspecting it was an intelligence operation. The broadcasts followed a carefully designed strategy. They began with intermittent transmissions that could barely be heard in Guatemala City, creating a sense of mystery and underground authenticity. Then, a week later, the CIA dramatically increased the transmitting power, allowing the signal to reach the capital with perfect clarity. Suddenly, the Voice of Liberation was everywhere. It aired 2-hour bulletins twice a day, filling the airwaves with a relentless stream of propaganda designed to destabilize Arbenz's government from within. The station reported troop movements that did not exist, announced the surrender of military units that had not surrendered, and described cities falling to rebel forces that had not fallen. It named government officials who had allegedly defected, creating paranoia and suspicion within Arbenz' inner circle. It issued warnings to the Guatemalan people, telling them to stay off the roads because all vehicles were now military targets, to avoid trains because railways were being sabotaged, and to prepare for the arrival of liberation forces who would reward loyalty and punish collaboration with the regime. The psychological effect was exponential. Even people who suspected the broadcasts might be exaggerated could not be certain. And in the absence of certainty, fear filled the void. The CIA had learned the power of radio propaganda the previous year during the 1953 coup in Iran, where similar tactics had helped topple Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Now, in Guatemala, the agency refined those techniques into an art form. The Voice of Liberation did not just broadcast news. It created an alternate reality, one in which Arbenz had already lost. The war was already over, and resistance was not just futile, but suicidal. Historians have credited these radio broadcasts as a decisive factor in the success of the coup, not because they reported the truth, but because they manufactured a truth that people were willing to believe. The CIA understood something profound about human psychology. People do not need absolute proof to abandon their convictions. They just need enough doubt, enough confusion, enough fear that staying loyal feels more dangerous than surrendering. And that is exactly what the Voice of Liberation delivered day after day, hour after hour, until the line between fact and fiction dissolved completely. On the morning of June 18, 1954, Carlos Castillo Armas led his invasion force across the Guatemalan border from Honduras. It was supposed to be a coordinated multi-front assault, the culmination of months of planning and millions of dollars in CIA funding. Instead, it was a near disaster. 10 trained saboteurs had been sent ahead with orders to blow up railways and cut telegraph lines, but their impact was minimal. A separate 60-man force that was supposed to attack from El Salvador never made it past the border. They were intercepted and jailed by Salvadoran police before they could even enter Guatemala. Castillo Armas himself commanded only about 480 men, lightly armed, poorly coordinated, and facing a Guatemalan military that outnumbered them by a significant margin. Within hours, the invasion began to stall. Rebel forces managed to seize a few small border towns, but they lacked the firepower and tactical cohesion to push deeper into the country. By any conventional measure, the operation should have failed in its first 48 hours. But Operation PBSUCCESS was never about conventional warfare. While Castillo Armas struggled on the ground, the CIA unleashed the second phase of the psychological assault. American pilots, hired by the agency and flying planes supplied by the United States, began conducting bombing raids over Guatemala. The targets were carefully chosen not for their military value, but for their psychological impact. They struck military bases, government buildings, and even civilian areas, including oil depots and infrastructure sites. The goal was not to destroy the Guatemalan military, but to create terror, chaos, and the overwhelming impression that Arbenz's government was under attack from an unstoppable force. The bombs themselves caused relatively limited physical damage, but the psychological damage was catastrophic. The sound of aircraft overhead, the explosions echoing through the capital, the sight of smoke rising from strategic locations, all reinforced the narrative that the Voice of Liberation had been broadcasting for weeks. The invasion was real, the rebels were winning, resistance was hopeless. At the same time, the CIA flooded the airwaves with even more aggressive propaganda. The Voice of Liberation now reported that multiple columns of liberation forces were converging on Guatemala City, just kilometers away and advancing rapidly. The broadcasts warned that bridges were being destroyed, that government officials were fleeing, that the army was in full retreat. They read fabricated messages from military commanders announcing their defection. They issued ultimatums to remaining loyalists, promising amnesty for those who surrendered and death for those who resisted. On June 26th, the station broadcast a chilling message it claimed had been issued by the Guatemalan chief of police, ordering all governors to immediately arrest anti-communist officials and execute them at the first sign of attack. It is unclear whether this message was real or another CIA fabrication, but its impact was undeniable. It painted Arbenz's government as paranoid, brutal, and on the verge of collapse. Inside the Guatemalan government, the pressure was unbearable. Jacobo Arbenz knew that the invasion force was small and that his military had the capability to crush it, but he also knew that the United States was behind the operation, and he understood that if he ordered a full-scale military response, the Americans might escalate. He faced an impossible choice: fight back and risk provoking a direct U.S. intervention, or stand down and watch his government crumble. Meanwhile, his own military commanders were wavering. The psychological warfare campaign had done its work. Officers who might have been willing to defend the government against a ragtag rebel army were far less willing to fight when they believed they were up against a massive CIA-backed force with American air support. The voice of liberation had convinced them that defeat was inevitable. Morale collapsed. Units began to stand down. Some officers quietly made contact with the rebels, positioning themselves for the transition they now saw as unavoidable. On June 27, 1954, just 9 days after the invasion began, Jacobo Arbenz resigned. In a final radio address to the Guatemalan people, he blamed the United Fruit Company and the government of the United States for orchestrating his downfall. He was not wrong, but by then, the truth no longer mattered. The voice of liberation had already written the narrative that the world would remember. A series of military juntas briefly took power in the chaotic days that followed, but the outcome was never in doubt. On July 7th, Carlos Castillo Armas assumed the presidency of Guatemala, installed by the CIA and recognized by the United States. Operation PBSUCCESS was officially over. The agency had achieved its objective. A government that threatened American corporate interests had been removed, and the method of removal had been brilliantly, ruthlessly efficient. The CIA had won a war without really fighting one. But here is the question: what does victory actually mean when it is built on lies? Because the story that the CIA told itself, the story it told the president, and the story it told the world was as much a fabrication as the broadcasts from the voice of liberation. After Arbenz resigned, Eisenhower called CIA Director Allen Dulles and his senior planners into a formal briefing to review the operation. The agency presented it as an unblemished triumph, a textbook example of covert action executed with precision and minimal bloodshed. According to the declassified account written by historian Nicholas Calather, who was given access to thousands of CIA operational files, the agency told President Eisenhower that only one of the rebels had been killed. Eisenhower reportedly responded with a single word: incredible. And it was, because it was not true. The CIA's own records documented that at least 4 people had died during the operation. But the lie was more convenient than the truth, and so the lie became the official history, at least for a while. Operation PBSUCCESS entered CIA lore as a model for future covert operations in Latin America, a proof of concept that psychological warfare could topple governments without the cost and risk of traditional military intervention. Before the coup even concluded, the CIA began systematically destroying evidence. On June 30, 1954, just 3 days after Arbenz resigned, the agency initiated a comprehensive document destruction process related to Operation PBSUCCESS. When a Senate Oversight Committee investigated the CIA's assassination programs in 1975 and requested information about the agency's plans to kill Guatemalan officials, the CIA claimed that all such records had been lost. This was almost certainly false. Declassified documents from the National Security Archive reveal that the CIA had been compiling assassination lists since early 1952, categorizing individuals as targets for what the agency euphemistically called executive action, meaning murder, or for imprisonment and exile. The lists were detailed and extensive. One memo from February 1952 carried the subject line, "Guatemalan communist personnel to be disposed of during military operations." It outlined categories of people to be neutralized and requested that CIA officers review the names and initial those who should be included on a final disposal list. The primary list, referred to internally as the A list, contained 58 names. In the declassified versions of these documents, every single name has been redacted, making it impossible to verify whether any of those individuals were actually killed. The CIA maintained that none of the assassination plans were implemented, and that may be technically accurate in the narrow sense that the agency did not personally carry out executions during the coup itself. But after Castillo Armas took power, hundreds of Guatemalans were rounded up and killed. Some were communists, many were not. They were labor organizers, teachers, journalists, land reform advocates, and anyone else deemed a threat to the new order. The CIA facilitated this by providing Castillo Armas with intelligence, training, and the implicit understanding that the United States would not object to whatever measures he deemed necessary to consolidate power. Approximately 120 Arbenz loyalists were allowed to leave the country, but countless others simply disappeared. The terror did not end in 1954. It metastasized. In the decades that followed, Guatemala descended into a brutal civil war that lasted 36 years. Successive military regimes, many of them trained and supported by the United States, waged a campaign of counterinsurgency that human rights organizations estimate killed more than 100,000 civilians. Indigenous communities, the same people who had been the primary beneficiaries of Arbenz's land reform, were systematically targeted. Entire villages were destroyed. The violence reached levels that international tribunals would later classify as genocide. And the roots of that genocide can be traced directly back to June of 1954, to a CIA operation that was supposed to be clean, surgical, and victimless. What made Operation PBSUCCESS so effective was not the size of the invasion force or the destructive power of the airstrikes. It was the weaponization of uncertainty. The CIA understood that you do not need to defeat an enemy if you can convince them they are already defeated. You do not need a massive army if you can make your opponent believe you have one. And you do not need to control the truth if you can create enough noise, enough contradiction, enough fear that people stop trusting their own perception of reality. The voice of liberation was not just a propaganda tool. It was a proof of concept for a new kind of warfare, one where the battlefield is the human mind and the weapons are information, misinformation, and the deliberate erosion of trust. In 1954, this was a novel and experimental strategy. Today, it is everywhere. The techniques pioneered in Guatemala have been refined, digitized, and deployed on a scale that the CIA planners of PBSUCCESS could never have imagined. Fake news, bot networks, deepfakes, and coordinated disinformation campaigns are now standard tools of statecraft and political warfare, but the core principle remains the same. If you can control what people believe, you can control what they do. The CIA considered the operation a success because it achieved its immediate objective. Arbenz was removed, United Fruit's land was returned, and American influence in Guatemala was restored. But the long-term consequences tell a different story. Guatemala never recovered the democratic progress it had made under Arbenz. The land reform was reversed. The wealth remained concentrated. The violence became institutionalized. And the precedent set by PBSUCCESS emboldened the CIA to pursue similar operations elsewhere, in Cuba, in Chile, in Nicaragua, always with the same promise that covert action could solve complex political problems without messy consequences. And always, the consequences arrived anyway, often decades later, in forms far worse than anyone had anticipated. The human cost of Operation PBSUCCESS was not measured in the 48 deaths that the CIA grudgingly admitted, or even in the hundreds killed in the immediate aftermath of the coup. It was measured in the 100,000 civilians who died in the civil war that followed, in the generations of trauma inflicted on indigenous communities, and in the democratic potential that was strangled in its infancy and never allowed to grow. If you've watched this far, you're someone who values understanding not just what happened, but why it matters. This channel exists to bring you stories like this. stories that reveal how intelligence agencies operate, how power is exercised in the shadows, and how history is shaped by decisions that were never supposed to become public. If that resonates with you, subscribe now so you don't miss the next investigation. And here is a question I want you to think about and answer in the comments. Do you think psychological warfare is more or less dangerous than traditional military force? I am genuinely curious where you stand on this, so let me know below. The most disturbing aspect of Operation PBSUCCESS is not that it happened, it is that it worked. The CIA achieved its objective with minimal American casualties, plausible deniability largely intact, and a new playbook for regime change that would be used again and again. The operation became a legend within the agency, studied and celebrated as a masterclass in covert action. But the celebration was built on a willful blindness to the actual outcomes. The agency measured success by whether the government fell, not by what rose in its place. It counted the cost in dollars spent and operatives deployed, not in lives destroyed and futures erased. And it treated Guatemala as a problem solved, rather than a wound opened that would bleed for generations. Declassified documents from the CIA's own historical review reveal an operation plagued by disasters, failed security measures, and military incompetence that nearly derailed the entire mission. The only reason PBSUCCESS succeeded was because the psychological warfare component was so effective that it compensated for every tactical failure on the ground. The invasion did not need to win battles. It just needed to exist long enough for the propaganda to do its work. In the years since 1954, the CIA has selectively declassified portions of the PBSUCCESS files, often with heavy redactions that obscure the most damaging details. The assassination lists remain largely censored. The full extent of the agency's collaboration with death squads and authoritarian regimes in the decades after the coup is still hidden. What has been released, however, is enough to confirm what many historians and human rights advocates have long argued. Operation PBSUCCESS was not an isolated incident or a regrettable anomaly. It was a deliberate policy choice executed with institutional support at the highest levels of the American government. And it established a pattern of intervention in Latin America that would define U.S. foreign policy for much of the Cold War. Guatemala was the laboratory. The techniques developed there would be exported, the justifications refined. And the human cost, always the human cost, would be borne by people who had no say in the decisions that shattered their lives. Carlos Castillo Armas did not last long. He was assassinated in 1957, just 3 years after the CIA installed him in power. His death triggered another wave of instability, and the cycle of coups and violence continued. But the United States got what it wanted. United Fruit's land was returned. The labor unions were crushed. The communists, real or imagined, were purged, and American influence in the region was reasserted. For the people of Guatemala, the cost was incalculable. The land reform that had promised dignity and autonomy to indigenous communities and landless peasants was dismantled. The democratic experiment that had begun with such hope in the late 1940s was extinguished. In its place came military rule, repression, and a counterinsurgency campaign that escalated into one of the most brutal conflicts in Latin American history. Villages were burned, mass graves were filled, and the survivors were left with a trauma so deep that it persists to this day. The CIA's psychological warfare campaign created something that outlasted the coup itself. It created a narrative, a story about communism and liberation and American heroism that was repeated so many times in so many contexts that it became accepted as truth. For years, many people in the United States believed that the 1954 coup was a justified response to a communist threat, that Arbenz was a Soviet puppet, and that the operation saved Guatemala from totalitarianism. Only decades later, as documents were declassified and historians pieced together the real story, did a different picture emerge. Arbenz was not a communist. He was a reformer whose crime was prioritizing his own people over foreign corporate profits. The Soviet Union had no significant presence in Guatemala, and the real threat was never to American security. It was to American business interests. But by the time the truth came out, the damage was irreversible. The techniques of psychological warfare that proved so effective in Guatemala did not disappear. They evolved. The voice of liberation was a primitive ancestor of the information operations that intelligence agencies around the world now conduct with digital precision. The principles are the same: create confusion, exploit fear, undermine trust in institutions, and shape perception until the line between reality and propaganda becomes impossible to distinguish. In 1954, it required radio transmitters and exiled announcers and carefully scripted bulletins. Today, it requires algorithms, social media accounts, and viral content. But the goal has not changed. Control the narrative, and you control the outcome. The ghosts of Operation PBSUCCESS haunt every modern disinformation campaign, every coordinated influence operation, every attempt to destabilize a government or manipulate public opinion through weaponized information. Operation PBSUCCESS stands as a testament to both the power and the peril of covert action. It proved that intelligence agencies could topple governments without conventional military force, that psychological warfare could be devastatingly effective, and that plausible deniability could shield political leaders from accountability, at least in the short term. But it also revealed the moral bankruptcy of measuring success purely by operational outcomes while ignoring the human consequences. The CIA celebrated PBSUCCESS as a triumph because it achieved the immediate objective of removing Arbenz from power. But any honest assessment must reckon with what came after: the decades of violence, the genocide, the shattered democracy, the generational trauma, and the loss of what Guatemala might have become if its people had been allowed to chart their own course without foreign interference. The story of Operation PBSUCCESS is not just history, it is a warning. It shows what happens when powerful nations decide that their interests justify any means, when covert operations are designed with no regard for the people who will live with the consequences, and when success is defined so narrowly that it ignores the moral and political wreckage left behind. The CIA operatives who planned and executed the coup were not monsters. They were professionals doing what they believed their country required of them. But the system that tasked them with that mission, the political leaders who authorized it, and the corporate interests that lobbied for it, created a machinery of intervention that inflicted suffering on a scale far beyond anything the operation's architects anticipated or acknowledged. And that machinery did not dismantle itself after Guatemala. It moved on to the next target and the next, leaving a trail of destabilized nations, broken democracies, and betrayed populations across Latin America and beyond. The final bitter irony of Operation PBSUCCESS is that it succeeded tactically while failing strategically. The CIA removed Arbenz and reinstalled a government friendly to American interests. But in doing so, it planted the seeds of a civil war that would rage for 36 years, radicalize entire generations of Guatemalans, and ultimately produce the very kind of extremism and instability that the operation was supposedly designed to prevent. The communism that Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers feared never took root in Guatemala in 1954. But the violence and repression that followed the coup created conditions in which revolutionary movements could and did flourish, leading to a conflict far bloodier and more destabilizing than anything Arbenz had ever contemplated. The CIA won the battle and lost the war, except the people who paid the price for that loss were not American policymakers or intelligence officers. They were Guatemalan farmers, teachers, students, and families who simply wanted to live in peace. The voice of liberation went silent on July 2, 1954, just days after Arbenz resigned. Its mission was complete. But the voices it silenced, the voices of democracy, reform, and self-determination, would take decades to find their way back, if they ever truly did. Guatemala today is still grappling with the legacy of 1954. Still excavating mass graves, still seeking justice for atrocities committed in the name of anti-communism, still trying to build the kind of inclusive, equitable society that Arbenz had envisioned over 70 years ago. The coup did not just remove a president, it stole a future. And no amount of tactical brilliance or operational success can justify that theft. Operation PBSUCCESS was not a triumph of intelligence tradecraft. It was a failure of moral imagination, a case study in how covert action can achieve immediate objectives while unleashing consequences that reverberate for generations. And the most important lesson it offers is one that intelligence agencies and political leaders have repeatedly failed to learn: that the power to topple governments comes with a responsibility to the people whose lives are upended in the process. And that responsibility cannot be evaded by destroying documents, classifying files, or simply moving on to the next operation. The story of Operation PBSUCCESS is a story about power, about the seductive efficiency of psychological warfare, and about the lies that nations tell themselves to justify actions they would condemn in others. It is a story about phantom armies that felt real, about broadcasts that rewrote reality, and about the terrible discovery that when you build a victory on illusion, the only thing that lasts is the suffering. And as we live in an age where information warfare is no longer experimental but ubiquitous, where the line between truth and fabrication grows thinner every day, the ghosts of Guatemala have something urgent to tell us. They whisper a warning we cannot afford to ignore: that the power to manipulate belief is the most dangerous weapon ever created, and that those who wield it, no matter how noble their intentions, risk becoming exactly the kind of threat they claim to fight. In June of 1954, the CIA proved that you can topple a government with sound waves and fear. What it failed to prove, what no intelligence agency has ever proven, is that the world becomes safer, freer, or more just when that power is used. Guatemala paid the price for that experiment, and the bill is still coming due.